A slave's voice. A story of freedom. Kalen Stark wasn't supposed to be here. He had slipped onto the shadowy streets of Drathis Prime under the guise of a tech salvager. The planet's sprawling black markets were infamous across the galaxy for dealing in everything from stolen starship parts to forbidden relics. But Kalen wasn't here for scrap or rare metals. He was tracking whispers of a powerful artifact tied to the ruins of an ancient civilization. What he found instead turned his stomach. The market was a chaos of shouts, flashing holograms, and jostling bodies, but it was the other section that made his skin crawl, the slave pens. Rows of beings, chained and silent, were displayed like merchandise. Kalen clenched his fists, forcing himself to move past it, even as guilt pricked at his conscience. Not my fight, he thought. He wasn't here to be a hero, just to complete his mission and disappear. Yet, as he turned to leave, something stopped him. She sat apart from the others, slumped against the cold metal bars of her cage. Unlike the others who trembled or stared with hollow eyes, she was still, eerily still. Her dark, almost iridescent skin caught the faint glow of the market lights, and her striking white hair cascaded over her face. She didn't look up when the traders barked at her, or when potential buyers poked at the bars of her cage. Kalen should have walked on. He should have ignored her like he ignored the rest. But when their eyes met, an accidental glance through the crowd, he froze. Her gaze pierced him. Those eyes weren't empty. They were alive, burning with something he couldn't define. Defiance? Fear? Desperation? Whatever it was, it gripped him like gravity. "Looking to buy, stranger?" a trader growled, sidling up to Kalen with a grin that revealed jagged teeth. Kalen hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't leave her there, not with those eyes. But what could he do? Drawing attention to himself could blow his cover, and even if he freed her, where would she go? What would she do? "I'll take her," Kalen heard himself say, his voice sharper than he intended. The trader looked surprised, but recovered quickly, his grin widening. "Oh, this one? She's mute, you know. Won't give you any trouble. Bit of a disappointment, really, but she's cheap." Kalen fought the urge to deck the man. Instead, he handed over a fistful of credits, ignoring the trader's sneering comments as the cage was unlocked. The walk back to his ship was tense. Nyx followed Kalen closely but silently, her chained hands clasped in front of her. She didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't look around. It was as if she were waiting. For what, Kalen didn't know. Once they reached his ship, Kalen locked the doors behind them and turned to her. For the first time, he noticed how frail she looked. Beneath her striking features, she was gaunt, her movements stiff and careful. "You're free now," he said awkwardly, holding up a small device. With a quick swipe, her wrist restraints clicked open and fell to the floor. Nyx stared at him, her expression unreadable. "I mean it," Kalen said, his voice softening. "I didn't buy you to keep you. You can go wherever you want." Her reaction wasn't what he expected. She didn't collapse with relief or burst into tears. Instead, she tilted her head, studying him with that same piercing gaze. "You don't believe me," Kalen muttered, scratching the back of his neck. "Figures." He took a step back, giving her space. "Fine, stay here if you want. Eat, rest. You're not a prisoner anymore." He turned to leave the room, giving her the chance to process what he'd said. "Why?" Kalen froze. The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was there. He turned slowly, his heart pounding as he met her gaze. "You spoke," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nyx looked surprised herself, as if she hadn't meant to say anything at all. Her lips pressed into a thin line and she turned away, her hands trembling. Kalen's mind raced. What had just happened? What was her story? And why did he feel like this was only the beginning? Kalen stood in the ship's dim corridor, his thoughts racing as the soft hum of the engines pulsed around him. Nyx hadn't spoken again since the startled whisper of her question, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. She sat in the corner of the cabin he'd hastily set up for her, her knees drawn to her chest, head resting on her arms. The collar still around her neck was a glaring reminder of where she'd been, and Kalen's jaw tightened every time he looked at it. He had tried speaking to her, quiet words, assurances that she was safe now, but every time she stared at him with the same wide, wary eyes, her silence a barrier he couldn't breach. Kalen sighed, running a hand through his hair as he entered the cockpit. The sprawling view of space stretched before him, a dark, endless void speckled with stars. He leaned over the controls, entering coordinates for a remote sector far from any prying eyes. He didn't know what to do next. He hadn't planned beyond freeing her. The weight of her fragile, uncertain trust rested heavily on his shoulders. Hours passed in relative quiet, save for the gentle hum of the ship's engines. Kalen spent the time working on minor repairs and adjustments, always keeping an ear open for any sign of movement from Nix's room. Eventually, his stomach reminded him it had been far too long since he'd eaten. He set about making something simple. Ration packs weren't much to boast about, but they were filling. After some hesitation, he made a second portion and carried it to her room. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing Nix exactly as he'd left her. She didn't move as he stepped inside, though her eyes flickered briefly toward him before darting away. "I brought you something to eat," he said, keeping his voice gentle. He placed the tray on the small table near her cot and stepped back, giving her space. Nix's gaze lingered on the food but didn't move to take it. Kalen watched her, frustration and sympathy warring within him. He sat down cross-legged on the floor a few feet away, careful not to make her feel cornered. "You don't have to be afraid," he said after a long moment. "I meant what I said. You're free. I won't hurt you." Nix remained still, her silence palpable. Her hands twitched, fingers curling slightly, but she made no other move. Kalen leaned back against the wall, his own plate untouched. "I know you're probably wondering why I bought you," he admitted. "The truth is, I don't even fully know myself. I didn't go to that market looking for a slave. I hate everything about it. But when I saw you—" He paused, frowning as he tried to find the right words. "It felt wrong to leave you there." For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition? Gratitude? But it was gone before he could be sure. Kalen sighed and picked up his plate, taking a bite of the bland rations. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. Honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you never did, but I'll do what I can to help you, for whatever that's worth." The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, until Kalen finally stood and made for the door. As it slid open, he glanced back. "If you need anything, just let me know." He was halfway down the corridor when a soft scraping sound made him pause. He turned, glancing back toward Nix's room. She had moved for the first time, her slender frame now hunched over the table, hands trembling slightly as she picked up the utensil. Kalen didn't approach, but he watched from the shadows as she took her first cautious bite. "Progress," he murmured to himself, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Kalen led Nix into the room, his hand hovering near the door before pushing it open with a soft creak. The newer room was larger, with a simple bed, a small table by the window, and a few modest furnishings. It was warmer, too, with soft light filtering through a curtain that rustled gently in the breeze. "Here you go," Kalen said, gesturing toward the bed. "It's not much, but it is better than the temporary room you had before, and it's a place you can call your own." Nix stood at the threshold, still uncertain. The silence between them had become heavy again. She hesitated, her gaze flickering between the bed and Kalen, her lips parted as if she might speak but couldn't find the words. Kalen, noticing the unease, gave her a reassuring nod. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one will come in, and no one will hurt you. This is your space." He took a small step back, giving her room to enter, but she lingered by the door, still trapped in the weight of her own thoughts. Kalen felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest at the sight, but he said nothing. Instead, he watched her for a long moment, silently hoping that in time she might find the comfort she needed. "I'll leave you to it for now," he added, his voice soft. "But I'm always just down the hall if you need anything." Before she could react, he turned, walking towards the door, but his thoughts lingered on her. Why hadn't she spoken again? Was she simply too afraid to trust him? Or was it something deeper, something he couldn't yet understand? In the days that followed, Nix's silence persisted. Kalen, true to his word, treated her with patience and respect, never pushing her beyond what she could handle. He spoke often, filling the quiet with anecdotes about his travels, his home on Earth, and his encounters with other species. Nix listened, though she rarely reacted. Her responses were subtle, a slight tilt of her head, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Kalen took these small gestures as progress, no matter how incremental. One evening, as they shared a meal in the cabin, Kalen noticed her gaze lingering on his plate. He raised an eyebrow, then held out a small portion of the Terran dish he'd been eating, a simple stew of vegetables and grains. "Want to try?" he asked, his tone light. Nix hesitated but eventually reached out, taking the offered bite with delicate fingers. As she tasted it, her expression shifted, confusion, then mild surprise. Kalen chuckled. "Not bad, huh? I figured you might like it." Her lips twitched. Just barely, but enough for Kalen to notice. It was the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her. Moments like these were small victories, but Kalen knew they were the foundation of something bigger. Slowly but surely the walls around Nix's heart were beginning to crack, and he was determined to help her rebuild, not as a slave, but as someone finally free to find her voice. The days passed in a rhythm, each one blending into the next. Kalen kept his distance, respecting her space, yet never allowing her to feel entirely alone. He made sure to leave food outside her door when she didn't come to join him at the table, and occasionally he would leave small trinkets he had collected from his travels, a smooth stone, a strange-looking flower, an intricate metal keychain from a distant planet. Sometimes she would pick up these objects and examine them for a moment, her fingers lingering over them, as though contemplating their significance. Kalen never asked what she thought about them, but he was hopeful. Small steps, he reminded himself. One evening, after they'd finished their meal in silence, Kalen decided to try something different. "You ever see a starship that could fly without a crew?" he asked, glancing over at her as she stared out the window, her face reflected in the glass. Nix's eyes flickered to him at the question, but she didn't speak. "I came across one during my travels," Kalen continued, not discouraged. "It was a relic, a century old, still floating out there in the void. It was eerie, really. I think it was designed to run on its own for short periods, but it got lonely. They say the crew's last transmission was full of strange noises, like the ship was talking to itself." Nix's fingers twitched slightly at the mention of the ship. Her eyes were wide, though she hadn't turned fully to face him. Her focus had shifted toward the window again, but there was something in the way she held herself, an almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, as if his words had stirred something within her. Kalen noticed the change, his curiosity piqued. He waited, not wanting to rush her. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned back in his chair, letting the silence settle between them. It was different this time, though. Less heavy, less awkward. After a long while, Nix spoke, her voice a soft murmur, barely more than a whisper. "Lonely ships." Kalen's heart skipped a beat at the sound of her voice. It was hoarse, unpracticed, but it was there. He leaned forward, excitement lacing his voice. "Yes, exactly," he said softly. "Lonely ships, like they were trying to reach out but no one was listening." Her fingers curled around the edge of her plate, and she seemed to focus on the small motions she was making. The words had come, and Kalen knew better than to push her further, but the simple fact that she had spoken at all felt like an enormous breakthrough. Do you feel lonely?" he asked, the question delicate, unsure of the answer he might get. Nix looked at him, her eyes slightly widening in surprise at his directness. For a moment there was nothing but silence, except for the soft hum of the ship in the background. Then her lips parted, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded, a barely perceptible motion. Kaylin's heart ached at the sight. He didn't want her to feel that way, not anymore. He smiled gently, offering her another small piece of the meal. "You're not alone now, Nix. You don't have to be." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was peaceful, like something important had been said without needing more words. For the first time, Kaylin believed it. She wasn't truly alone anymore. As the days passed, their quiet routine settled into something more comfortable. Kaylin noticed the small yet meaningful changes in Nix, her occasional nods of understanding, her soft gazes when she thought he wasn't looking, the moments when she reached for the food he offered without hesitation, or when she shifted her posture toward him, indicating she was starting to feel a little more at ease. Still, the silence remained, but Kaylin could sense the layers of it were thinning. Even in her quietest moments, Nix wasn't completely withdrawn anymore. She was listening, really listening, and that was something. One evening, as they sat together in the galley, the conversation turned to travel stories. Kaylin spoke of Earth's history, its cities, its wars, and the beauty of the planet's wild landscapes. As he described the lush forests and towering mountains, Nix's attention seemed more focused, her eyes following his every word. "And in the mountains," Kaylin continued, "the air is thinner, the sky feels closer. It's like you can touch the stars. I think that's what made the old explorers so fascinated by it." Nix's head tilted slightly to the side, a gesture Kaylin had come to recognize as her curiosity peeking through, but she didn't speak. Not yet. "Do you like stars?" Kaylin asked, his voice gentle. "Are you interested in what's out there?" Nix's gaze shifted to the window for a moment, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing a pattern on her plate. Then, as if to answer him, she nodded ever so slightly, and this time she said something, soft yet distinct. "Yes." Kaylin blinked, taken aback. Her voice had the slightest rasp, but there was a sense of clarity there. "Stars," she whispered again, the word lingering in the air. He smiled, heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. "They are beautiful, aren't they?" Nix looked back at him, her face unreadable for a moment before her lips parted once more. "Do you think I could see them?" Her voice was soft, tentative, as though the question itself was both a hope and a challenge. Kaylin's heart raced. This was the first real sentence she'd spoken to him, and the weight of it struck him hard. "Of course," he said without hesitation. "You'll see them. We'll find a way." The rest of the evening passed in a sort of stunned silence, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was filled with a quiet promise. Nix had spoken again, and though it wasn't much, it was a step, a huge step, toward something he wasn't sure how to define yet, but something he hoped for all the same. As he prepared to leave the galley and give her space for the night, Kaylin paused at the door, glancing back at her. "Tomorrow we'll go to the observation deck," he said with a grin. "You'll see the stars, I promise." Nix's eyes followed him, the faintest hint of something shifting in her expression, something softer, warmer. For the first time, Kaylin felt like they were getting somewhere. There was no rush, no pressure, but for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope. He had no idea what the future held, but right now, in this moment, Nix had taken a step toward it, and that was enough. The following day, as the ship drifted through the quiet expanse of space, Kaylin led Nix to the observation deck. The walls were made of clear, reinforced glass, giving them a panoramic view of the stars. It was one of Kaylin's favorite spots on the ship, the quiet, the vastness, and the sense of peace it provided. It felt like a place where anything was possible, a place where time slowed. As they stepped inside, Kaylin paused, allowing Nix to take in the view. The endless sea of stars stretched out before them, sparkling in the darkness of space. Kaylin's breath caught for a moment, wondering how it must feel for Nix, who had likely never seen such vastness before. "You can sit here," he said gently, pointing to one of the seats near the glass. "It's the best spot." Nix hesitated at first, but then slowly made her way to the seat, lowering herself onto it with a grace that betrayed her restraint. Kaylin sat beside her, giving her space, but close enough that she could feel his presence. Calm, patient. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Kaylin watched as Nix's gaze drifted out toward the stars. The soft glow from the viewport illuminated her features, casting shadows that seemed to add to her mystery. Her eyes, wide and curious, studied the cosmos with a quiet intensity. After some time, Nix's voice broke the silence. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice still soft but clearer than before. The rasp was gone now, replaced by a certain steadiness. Kaylin smiled, his heart warming at the sound of her voice. "Yeah, it really is. You can see so much out here, so many things, endless possibilities." "I never thought I would see this," Nix continued, her eyes still fixed on the stars. "I didn't think I would ever be free enough to see something like this." Kaylin was quiet for a moment, letting her words sink in. He didn't press her for more. Instead, he simply nodded. "You deserve to see it. You deserve to see everything." Nix's gaze flickered to him then, her lips twitching ever so slightly as though trying to smile, but it was fleeting. The past was still too heavy, the silence between them still too deep. Kaylin knew this wasn't just about seeing the stars, it was about something bigger, something more fragile. The journey they were on was still long, and the walls Nix had built would take time to come down. But Kaylin could feel the shift, the subtle signs of trust starting to form between them. The fact that she was sitting here, speaking, sharing a moment with him, it was progress, even if it didn't feel like much. He leaned back in his chair, looking out at the stars with her. "There's so much more to see," he said after a while. "Places you've never dreamed of, and things you've never thought possible. I'll show you everything, Nix. Just don't give up on me." Nix's gaze shifted toward him, a flicker of something in her eyes. "I won't," she said quietly, and Kaylin knew she meant it. For the first time since they had met, Kaylin felt the weight of their journey lighten, if only a little. It wasn't about making her forget her past or about pushing her to speak more. It was about the moments they shared, the slow progress, and the understanding that even the smallest steps forward meant something. For now, that was enough. And for the first time in a long while, Kaylin allowed himself to believe that together, they might just find a way to navigate the dark unknown of space, and maybe, just maybe, find the light at the end of it. As the days passed, Kaylin and Nix continued to build their strange but growing bond. Their conversations, though still sparse, were moments of connection in the midst of the vast emptiness of space. Kaylin made it a point to include her in everything, from helping with the ship's minor repairs to explaining the different cultures and species they'd encounter along their journey. She listened, not always responding, but always present, her eyes searching, absorbing, and learning. One afternoon, as Kaylin worked on a control panel in the engine room, Nix appeared at the entrance, standing silently for a moment. He looked up, surprised to see her there. Her presence still seemed to command the space around her, even in her silence. "Something on your mind?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Nix hesitated, her fingers grazing the doorframe. She had grown more comfortable around him, yet there were still times when she appeared almost fragile, as though afraid to disturb the delicate balance between them. "Can I help?" she asked softly, her voice steady but quiet. Kaylin smiled, glad to hear her voice again. "Sure. You've been picking up things fast. If you want to help, there's a console over there," he said, pointing to a nearby station. "I could use an extra set of hands." Nix nodded and approached, her steps measured but purposeful. She sat at the console, scanning the data readouts. Kaylin watched her for a moment before turning back to his work. The silence between them was comfortable now, not oppressive. For a few minutes they worked side by side. Nix's concentration was unwavering as she worked through the diagnostics, her eyes flicking between the screens, absorbing the information in a way Kaylin hadn't expected. He'd been so used to thinking of her as someone who had been broken, someone who needed fixing. But in these quiet moments, it became clear. Nix was stronger than she appeared, and she had a sharp mind, one that had been stifled by her past. "You're doing great," Kaylin said, glancing over at her. "I've never seen anyone pick this up so quickly." Nix looked up briefly, her eyes meeting his. For a fleeting moment he saw something more in her gaze, a flicker of something hopeful, something almost like a smile waiting to be born. "I don't forget easily," she said simply, returning to the console. Kaylin's chest tightened at her words. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. She was starting to trust him more. She was letting him in, bit by bit. The sound of the console beeping interrupted his thoughts. Nix's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to Kaylin. "We're on course to reach the next station," she said, her voice soft but confident. Kaylin nodded, impressed by her newfound ease in speaking. "Thanks, you're a quick learner." As they finished up their work, Kaylin couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not in himself, but in Nix, in the way she had found her voice again, in the way she was healing, and in the way she had chosen to take control of her own fate. That evening, after their work was done, Kaylin invited Nix to join him in the mess hall for dinner. He had grown used to the quiet between them, but tonight felt different. There was a new energy in the air, a lightness that hadn't been there before. They sat across from each other, the sounds of the ship's hum filling the background. Kaylin was finishing his meal when Nix, for the first time, reached for her plate without hesitation. "You're eating more," he observed, noticing the way she was picking at her food more freely than before. Nix glanced up, her expression unreadable, but there was a slight change in her demeanor, something softer, something more open. "I'm not used to food like this," she admitted quietly, her fingers pausing on the plate. "But it's better than what I had." Kaylin smiled, setting down his utensils. "Well, it's all you can eat from now on. You don't ever have to worry about that again." For the first time, Nix's lips parted slightly as though she might say something more, but the words didn't come. Instead, she picked up her fork and in silence they continued eating. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was companionable, something they had built together without needing to force anything. The connection between them was subtle but undeniable. As Kaylin finished his meal, he leaned back in his chair looking over at Nix. There were still miles to go before they reached their destination, but something in him told him that, despite everything, they had already begun the most important part of their journey. The days that followed were a quiet hum of routine. Kaylin and Nix worked together side by side, learning more about each other in their silence. Nix, while still reserved, had begun to show subtle signs of trust, her responses growing more frequent, more genuine. She no longer flinched at his presence, no longer recoiled from the sound of his voice. It was a slow process, but it was progress, and that was all Kaylin could ask for. One evening, as the stars stretched out before them, their ship drifting through the dark reaches of space, Kaylin found Nix sitting by the viewport, her gaze lost in the distance. Her silhouette was framed by the vastness outside, a figure alone but not truly lonely. "Mind if I join you?" Kaylin asked, standing a few steps behind her. Nix didn't answer at first, but after a moment she shifted to make room beside her on the bench. Kaylin sat down, his posture casual, trying to match her energy. They sat in silence for a while, just watching the stars streak by. It was peaceful, and in a strange way it felt like they were both on the same journey, not just physically across the galaxy, but emotionally as well. After some time, Nix spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Her question caught Kaylin off guard. It was simple, yet profound. Kaylin turned to her, meeting her gaze. He hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated her breaking the silence with something so direct, but he didn't shy away. "Doing what?" he asked gently, giving her space to explain. "Helping me. When you didn't have to," she clarified, her voice a bit stronger now, more assertive. I'm not your responsibility." Kaylin exhaled softly, thinking for a moment before answering. "No, you're not, but you deserve a chance at a life that isn't defined by your past." He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms in a relaxed manner. "I can't change what happened to you, but I can give you the space to figure out what you want from the future." No one should have to live in silence because of their past. Nix's fingers flexed, her eyes still locked on the stars outside. Her breath was slow, steady, and Kaylin could sense she was processing his words. "I don't know what I want," she admitted after a long pause, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "But I'm starting to think maybe I can find it." Kaylin gave her a small nod. "That's all I want for you, to find your voice in whatever way it happens." She turned to him then, her eyes meeting his with a look that was deeper than words, a silent exchange of gratitude and perhaps, in some way, understanding. The stars outside continued to streak by, the silence between them no longer awkward but comfortable. Kaylin didn't try to fill it with more words, instead letting the quiet be a space for Nix to breathe and think. They didn't speak again that night, but for the first time the silence didn't feel like something between them. It felt like a part of the journey they were taking together. The next day, the atmosphere on the ship was different. There was a quiet energy to everything, a new kind of understanding in the air. Kaylin noticed Nix taking more initiative with small tasks around the ship, adjusting the control panel, offering her help with minor repairs. Each small act was a step forward. Kaylin had given her the freedom to choose, to decide how much she wanted to share, how much of herself she was willing to let him in on. It was hard for him to imagine how long she had been trapped in silence, her mind likely a tumult of thoughts, but Kaylin believed in patience, in letting people come to terms with their own healing. One morning, as they prepared to reach the next space station, Kaylin was in the cockpit making final adjustments when he heard Nix enter. She didn't speak, but he could feel her presence, the way she stood there almost expectantly. Kaylin didn't look up at first, but then he felt her presence shift. It was different from the usual quiet. This was purposeful. He turned, surprised to see Nix holding something out. It was a small metallic device, a communication relay. It was an old piece of equipment Kaylin had abandoned in favor of more advanced systems. "Want to try?" Kaylin asked, genuinely curious. Nix nodded once, her expression calm, and placed the device on the table in front of him. With a focused look, she adjusted it, her fingers moving with precision as she began working through the settings. Her brow furrowed in concentration, and Kaylin watched her, impressed by her swift and efficient movements. The moment was small, but to Kaylin, it was monumental. Nix was stepping forward again, taking her own steps toward a life of her own choosing. "Looks like you've got it," Kaylin said, smiling as she finished. Nix met his eyes and nodded, her lips quirking into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It was the first real sign of communication since the day they had met. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft. Kaylin's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, just 2 words, but for him it was everything. It was the first step in their journey together, the first step of her journey toward reclaiming her life and voice. "You're welcome," he said softly, his gaze meeting hers with a mixture of pride and warmth. In that moment, Kaylin realized that helping Nix wasn't just about saving her from her past, it was about helping her see the strength in her own future, and he was ready for the next chapter of their journey, whatever it may bring. The quiet buzz of the device filled the room as Nix worked, her fingers deftly adjusting the settings. Kaylin leaned back, watching her with a mix of admiration and curiosity. He had never seen someone interact with technology like this before, not without a word spoken. After a few moments, Nix finally looked up, meeting Kaylin's gaze for the first time that evening. She tilted her head slightly as though gauging his reaction. "Well, it's working," Kaylin said with a smile, his voice light. "I didn't expect you to fix it that quickly." Nix didn't smile back, but Kaylin noticed a faint glimmer in her eyes, a recognition of accomplishment, perhaps. She didn't speak, but her quiet confidence spoke volumes. "You know," Kaylin continued, his tone softer now, "I'm not trying to rush you. I'm just trying to show you that you're not alone here, that I'm not here to control you." Nix's eyes flickered briefly to the floor, her fingers still resting on the device, but she didn't say anything. It was a familiar silence, but this time it felt different. There was no defensiveness, no withdrawal. It was simply the quiet of someone trying to make sense of their surroundings. Kalen cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the silence press down on him. I guess what I'm trying to say is that you don't have to do anything you don't want to. If you don't feel ready to speak, that's okay. But just know that you don't have to hide. He wasn't sure if she understood, but her eyes were locked onto his, and for a brief moment he saw something there, something more than just fear. Maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward trust. Nyx remained silent, her eyes still on Kalen, but there was a shift in her gaze. It was subtle, but Kalen could see it, a hint of something more than mere curiosity. Maybe it was just the smallest crack in the wall she had built around herself, but it was there, and that was enough for Kalen. He stood up slowly, not wanting to break the fragile moment. "I'll leave you to it," he said quietly, motioning to the device she was still working with. "If you need anything, I'm just outside." Kalen turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Nyx's voice stopped him. "Thank you." The words were soft, almost too soft to be heard. Kalen's heart skipped a beat, his hand hovering over the door handle. He slowly turned back to face her, his breath caught in his throat. Nyx was looking at him now, her expression as unreadable as ever, but there was something about her tone, something genuine. Did you just say something?" Kalen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she seemed to consider the words carefully, as though weighing the gravity of what she had just done. Finally, her voice broke the silence again. I've never thanked anyone before." Kalen nodded, a small, understanding smile pulling at his lips. "I'm glad you did." There was a long pause between them, but this time the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement that perhaps they were both on the same path, learning to navigate this uncertain space. Kalen turned once more to leave, but this time he felt a small sense of peace settle in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, Nyx was starting to trust him. As he stepped out into the hall, he couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. He was more determined than ever to help Nyx find her voice, not as a slave, but as someone who could reclaim her humanity. The days that followed were quieter, but there was a tangible shift between them. Nyx spent more time working with the communications device. Each time Kalen watched, it seemed to bring her closer to some unspoken goal. Her concentration deepened, but so did her moments of quiet introspection. Kalen noticed how she would often pause in the middle of her tasks, lost in thought, her expression distant. Kalen respected her space, understanding that this journey would take time. But he also knew there was more beneath the surface, a whole world of thoughts and feelings that Nyx had kept buried for so long. His role was no longer just to protect her, but to help her find the strength to share those hidden pieces of herself. One evening, after a long day of repair work on the ship, Kalen found himself outside Nyx's door again, hesitating. He had grown used to the silence between them, but it didn't feel quite right anymore. He knocked gently, not waiting for an invitation before stepping in. Nyx was sitting on her bed, the communication relay now set aside, her fingers tracing the edges of a worn old book she had found earlier that week. Kalen noticed the book wasn't one of his. It was a battered piece of literature from another world. A small detail, but it told him she was seeking something. She didn't look up when he entered, but she didn't pull away either. Kalen's heart pounded, and for a moment he couldn't find the words to break the silence. But he didn't have to. "I never asked," Kalen started, his voice soft. "What is it that you're looking for?" Nyx's eyes flickered to him, and she didn't speak right away. Her hand rested on the book, as if grounding herself. Kalen waited, understanding that this wasn't something she could say easily. "Escape," she finally whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I don't know if I've ever known what it's like to be free, not in the way you think." Kalen sat down slowly across from her, his expression open but respectful. "I know what it's like to feel trapped," he said quietly. "We all do in some way. But what I don't understand is, why is it so hard to believe that you could have a choice? Nix's gaze locked onto his, her eyes still holding a deep, unreadable pain. Because I've been told all my life that I don't have one. Not really. The price I paid for being born like this, my voice, my very existence was sold before I even knew what it meant to live. Kalen's heart ached as he heard the words he had feared. She wasn't just a slave, she was someone who had been denied everything, even the chance to believe she could be free. "Why did you buy me?" she asked suddenly, her voice growing stronger. The question took him by surprise, but Kalen didn't hesitate. "Because I felt something," he said simply. "A connection. And I knew there was more to you than just the scars." Nix didn't respond immediately, but the faintest flicker of something, hope, perhaps, passed through her gaze. "You don't have to keep hiding from me," Kalen added gently. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." She looked down at the book again, her fingers clenching the worn edges. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore. I don't even know how to trust myself. Everything I've ever known, it's been a lie. A set of rules I never had a choice in." Kalen watched her, understanding how hard this was for her. "Nix, I get it. Trust is earned, not given. But I'm not here to take something from you. I'm here to help you find a place where you can finally decide what you want. And when you're ready, I'll be here to listen." For the first time in days, Nix exhaled deeply, the weight of her emotions seeming to lift slightly, just enough for Kalen to see the person behind the silence. Her eyes softened, her voice barely a whisper. "I never thought I'd get to choose anything. I thought the world was over for me. I thought it would always be this way." Her gaze met his, filled with the rawest vulnerability. "I don't know what to do with the idea that I could change that." Kalen smiled, his tone calm but filled with unwavering conviction. "Start with this. You're not alone in this fight. You never have to be." She looked at him, a silent understanding passing between them. It was a moment that Kalen would hold on to, knowing that Nix's walls were finally beginning to crumble. They wouldn't be torn down all at once, but each piece she allowed herself to share was a step toward freedom, not just from her past, but from the chains she had placed on herself. With a quiet nod, Nix stood up, crossing the room and carefully sitting beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't filled with the weight of oppression. It was a comfortable quiet, a peaceful one. Kalen turned to her, a question in his eyes. "Can we start over?" Her lips quirked into the slightest of smiles. "I think we already have." And for the first time, Kalen truly believed they were both on the same path. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted between them. There were no grand declarations, no sudden, overwhelming changes, just small moments, quiet exchanges, unspoken understandings. Nix still wasn't ready to fully speak, but there were glimmers of progress, little steps that told Kalen she was slowly letting her guard down. Kalen found himself looking for reasons to spend more time with her, to give her space to open up on her own terms. Sometimes he would talk about the places he'd been, stories from Earth, the people he'd met, the places that had shaped him. He would ask her questions about herself, but he always respected her silence, never pressing her to reveal anything she wasn't ready to. One morning as they sat on the observation deck, Kalen caught her staring out into the vastness of space. Her gaze was distant, focused on the stars stretching endlessly before them. He could tell she was thinking, lost in some private world of her own. He moved quietly to her side, taking a seat next to her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, not wanting to disturb her too much. Nix didn't immediately respond. She only continued staring at the stars, her brow furrowed. Then, after a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like there's more out there? Not just stars, but more?" Kalen turned his gaze to the stars as well, contemplating her question. "More?" he repeated softly, his mind drifting. "I think that's what this whole journey is about, isn't it? Looking for more, not just in the stars, but in ourselves." Nix looked at him, her eyes softening just slightly. I used to think everything had a place, that I was just supposed to follow along. But now, I don't know. She shook her head. It feels like I'm looking for something, but I don't know what. Kaylin studied her, understanding. I think you're looking for freedom, to be something other than what they told you had to be. Her gaze flickered away, and for a brief moment Kaylin saw something like fear in her eyes. And if I find it, what happens then? Kaylin didn't hesitate. Then you decide what to do with it. I can't tell you what that will be, but I do know this. You'll have the power to choose. There was a long silence between them, filled with the weight of possibility. Nix turned her eyes back to the stars, her fingers fidgeting at the edge of her sleeve, lost in thought. Kaylin waited patiently, giving her the time she needed. You know, Nix said finally, her voice stronger than before, I used to dream of being free. I don't know how to explain it. It's like a feeling I had when I was younger, before everything changed. I would close my eyes, and for a moment it was like I could be anyone, someone who wasn't locked away. Her voice trailed off, and Kaylin could sense the vulnerability in her words. It was a rare moment of honesty, and it made Kaylin feel like they had crossed another boundary together. He gave her a small, encouraging smile. Maybe that person is still inside you, he said gently. The one who wasn't locked away, the one who has the power to choose her own path. And maybe that's the person you're becoming again. For the first time, Nix met his gaze without hesitation, and Kaylin could see a flicker of something new in her eyes, a spark of hope, maybe. That's what I want, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. I want to be her again. I want to choose. Kaylin's heart swelled with pride. You will. I'll be right here with you. There was another long silence, but this one was different, filled with unspoken understanding. Kaylin didn't know where their journey would take them, but he knew they would face it together. Nix had begun to find her voice, not just in words, but in action, and Kaylin, ever patient, would continue to help her along the way. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was someone with a future to build, a future where she could choose her own destiny. And Kaylin would be by her side as she discovered just how much she could truly accomplish. The days continued to pass in a steady rhythm, their partnership growing stronger with each shared meal, each quiet moment spent in the presence of the stars. Nix's silence had lessened, though she still didn't speak often. She would nod or gesture or sometimes give a soft reply, but there was always a distance. Kaylin didn't mind. He understood, and he had all the time in the world for her to find her way. It was in the small things that Kaylin saw the most progress. He'd catch her looking out at the stars more often, her expression focused but calm. She'd ask more questions about Earth, about the people and the places Kaylin had known, and every time she asked, it felt like a little more of the shell around her was cracking. One night, as they sat in the common room, Kaylin noticed Nix looking at the stars again. She seemed lost in thought, her hand resting on her knee, fingers twitching slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I used to look at the stars when I was younger, she said suddenly, her voice a little hesitant. I'd imagine what it would be like to be somewhere else, somewhere far away. Kaylin smiled, leaning forward slightly. And what would you imagine? Nix's gaze remained fixed on the stars, but there was a softness to her expression now. I'd imagine being free, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, not bound to anything, not tied down, just floating out there with the stars. Her words struck a chord deep within Kaylin, and he nodded slowly. Maybe we're all just looking for our place in the stars, he said softly. Maybe that's where we find our freedom. Nix didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, her eyes fixed on the endless expanse before them. But Kaylin could see the quiet determination in her. She wasn't just looking for freedom. She was ready to claim it. And Kaylin knew, whatever the future held, he would be there beside her, every step of the way. The journey that had started as an unexpected purchase had turned into something Kaylin never anticipated. As the days passed, Nix's silence gradually shifted. She would still speak rarely, but when she did, her words were more deliberate, more meaningful, and the bond they shared grew stronger with each passing day. However, something in the air had changed recently. The quiet between them felt different, heavier, as if there was something Nix was keeping to herself, something unspoken, but weighing heavily on her mind. Kaylin could sense it, even though she hadn't directly addressed it. One evening, as they sat in the observation room of the ship, the hum of the engines resonating through the walls, Kaylin turned to Nix. She was gazing out the large viewport, her expression distant. Something had been gnawing at him, something he couldn't shake. "Nix," Kaylin began carefully, "you've been quiet lately, more than usual. Is something wrong?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she turned toward him, her eyes meeting his for the first time that day, and for a moment Kaylin saw something fragile in her gaze. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, her voice soft, "about everything, about the way I've been living, the way things used to be." Kaylin remained silent, giving her the space she needed to continue. He could feel her wrestling with something deep inside her, something that wasn't easy to put into words. "It feels like I'm—" Nix hesitated, then shook her head as if the words didn't come easily. "Like I'm building something, but I don't know what it is, or if I'm even supposed to have it." Kaylin's heart tightened at her words. He could see the conflict in her, the doubt, the fear of what it meant to truly be free. She had been a slave for so long, her whole life defined by others. Now she was standing at the edge of a vast, uncertain future. "I don't know what freedom looks like," Nix whispered, looking down at her hands. "I've been taught how to survive, how to obey, but not how to choose for myself. I've spent so much time thinking about being free, but now that I am, it's scarier than I thought." Kaylin took a deep breath, his own uncertainty rising to the surface. He'd never had to fight for his freedom. He had always been free. But he understood that the freedom Nix was talking about wasn't just about leaving behind a life of slavery. It was about finding her place in a world she didn't know. "Freedom isn't a destination, Nix," Kaylin said gently. "It's not something you wake up and suddenly have. It's a process. It's about making choices, about finding what matters to you and building from there. You're not alone in this, not anymore." Nix glanced at him, her eyes still tinged with doubt, but searching for something in his words. "I'm not sure I can do it." "You can," Kaylin assured her. "I'll be with you every step of the way. You're stronger than you think. You've already done the hardest part by being here, by letting go of the past." Nix looked away for a moment, her eyes drawn back to the stars. Her expression softened, and for the first time in days, Kaylin saw a flicker of hope in her gaze. "I want to believe that," she said softly, almost to herself. Kaylin gave her a small smile. "You will, in time." A few days later, the ship docked at a remote outpost, an old station that Kaylin had used for resupply during his travels. It was an unremarkable place, but it would offer them a brief respite before continuing their journey. Kaylin had made plans to restock the ship's supplies, but there was something else he needed to do, something he hadn't told Nix yet. He found her in the common room, her back to him as she flipped through some old data files on a terminal. He paused in the doorway, watching her. There was something different about her, something stronger. Kaylin had come to admire her determination to change, to step away from the darkness that had defined her. "Nix," he began, his voice hesitant. She turned, her eyes locking onto his. "What is it?" Kaylin stepped closer, gathering his thoughts. "There's something I need to tell you, something important." Her brows furrowed in confusion, and he noticed the way her posture tensed, a reflex she couldn't hide. "It's about your past," Kaylin said gently, watching her carefully. Nix's face paled, and she immediately looked down at the floor, her breath catching in her throat. Kaylin could see the walls start to rise again, and he knew she was retreating back into herself. The trauma she carried was still fresh, still raw. Kaylin hesitated, reaching out, but he didn't want to push her too hard. "I don't want to force you to talk about it if you're not ready, but there are things I need you to know, things I think you should hear." Nix was silent for a long moment before she nodded, almost imperceptibly. Kaylin gave her the space she needed to decide. "We're not alone in this, Nix," Kaylin continued. "You don't have to face the ghosts of your past alone." It was a long, hard conversation that followed, one that brought out memories and emotions Nix had buried for so long. She opened up, bit by bit, sharing things she'd kept locked away, her voice barely a whisper at times. But Kaylin never pushed, never rushed her. He let her speak when she was ready, and slowly, the weight of her past seemed to lighten, just a little. By the end of their conversation, Nix was sitting across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, but her eyes were different, softer. "I don't know how to move on," she admitted quietly. "How to let go." Kaylin reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "You don't have to do it all at once, just one step at a time." She squeezed his hand, a silent thank you in her eyes. Kaylin smiled, though there was a bittersweetness to it. "We're in this together, Nix, no matter what comes next." And for the first time, Nix believed him. The station was dark and quiet, an abandoned outpost that had long since lost its former purpose. A few stray ships were docked in the hangars, their owners too busy to maintain them or simply too lost to care, the kind of place that felt forgotten, much like Nix had felt for so long. Kaylin had left her alone in their quarters, giving her space to explore the station. She'd asked about the old station's history, and Kaylin had casually mentioned that it had been used for trade routes long before the Krath War had changed everything. But Nix wasn't just curious about the history of the station. She was drawn to something else. The quiet corridors felt colder than they should have. The hum of the ancient systems echoed eerily through the long halls as she moved past abandoned crates and old terminals. The silence felt suffocating, yet it allowed her mind to wander, back to the days she had spent in the slave market, back to the night she was sold. It hadn't been a typical sale. Nix had been marked, a rare and valuable mute slave. Her inability to speak had been a valuable asset to the traders, something they could exploit without the risk of rebellion. And while she had been held in countless markets over the years, there had always been one face that had stayed with her, haunting her in the quiet moments, her former master. She'd never said his name. She had refused to say it, even when the traders offered it to her like an unspoken curse. He had been the one to sell her, the one to put the price tag on her life. And now, as she wandered the dusty hallways of this forgotten outpost, she found herself standing in front of an old, rusted door. Something about it pulled at her, a memory long buried stirring in the depths of her mind. Nix hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time in years, her hands trembled. She opened the door. Inside, the room was dim, lit by the soft glow of old monitors and the occasional flicker of broken lights. And there, standing in the center of the room, was a man she never thought she would see again, her former master. It wasn't him, not exactly, but it was his presence, his face. The man was older now, his once young features now marred by time. His clothes were tattered, his demeanor unkempt, but it was still him. He turned to face her as if he knew she was there, even before she stepped inside. His eyes narrowed, a sneer curling at the edges of his lips. "Well, well, look who's come crawling back," he muttered, his voice thick with disdain. Nix's chest tightened. The memories flooded back, the fear, the helplessness, the way she had been used and discarded. She had spent so many years thinking about him, wondering if she would ever get the chance to make him understand, to make him feel what she had felt. But now, standing in front of him, she felt something different, something she hadn't expected. She felt nothing, no anger, no fear, just a deep, hollow space where those feelings used to be. "You..." Nix's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to make him pause. "You're nothing to me anymore." The man stepped back, his face going pale at her words. "What?" You think you can just walk away from me, from what I gave you? I gave myself to you, Nix said, her voice growing stronger. You didn't take me. I was a slave to my own mind. I didn't know what freedom meant until now. The man's eyes widened with disbelief. You think you're free? You think you can just escape what you were? Nix shook her head slowly. I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's. She turned and walked toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight that had hung over her for years was gone, replaced by something lighter. She didn't need to make him apologize. She didn't need to make him regret anything. What she needed was to let it go. As she stepped into the corridor, the door behind her slammed shut with finality. Later that night, Kaylin found Nix standing in the observation room again, staring out into the vast expanse of space. The stars outside twinkled, distant and indifferent to everything that had transpired. Kaylin approached her slowly, unsure of what to say. Is it over? He asked, his voice low. Nix turned toward him, her eyes bright, but there was no hesitation in her gaze anymore. It is, she said softly. I'm free now. Kaylin smiled, his heart lifting at the sight of her calm resolve. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could see it in her eyes. She had confronted her past, and now she was ready to leave it behind. You're not a slave anymore, Nix, Kaylin said gently. You never were. Nix smiled for the first time in a long time, the weight of everything lifting from her shoulders. I know, and I'm never going back. She turned back to the stars, her expression peaceful. I'm free. And in that moment, Kaylin knew she was, and he was too. Together they would face whatever the future held, side by side.